Lord, thank you for allowing us to be here tonight. Thank you for allowing us to gather together to study your word and to help us to maybe refine study habits that we already have, to just give us additional insights into the scripture, just to maybe better equip ourselves or to think about things in a way that we've maybe just not thought about them before. It just gives us that much greater appreciation for your word. We ask that you be with really just everybody, the entire country, those that we mentioned tonight, COVID. I ask that you be with the Haiti situation, everybody on our prayer list. The needs are many and diverse. Only you can know all of them at once, and to be able to place your guiding hand upon those situations. And we just ask that you do that you would be with those individuals and that your will would be done. We ask these things in your son's holy name. Amen. Now, we may have a problem here. Well, it's lost in transit, it looks like. And we will have like 0 class if I can't find my notes. Talk amongst yourselves. I didn't go too far. I should be able to find it real quick.
You were going to say hospital or else?
Yeah.
He's down the driveway. Well, he is retired now. He's on drywall. Well, yeah.
Why do you have $3?
He was here visiting one year. Yeah. About the last day. 37.
All right, we are back. Remember, doors closed, paper rustling to a minimum. Not sure why. Oh yeah, because the video, we lose quality in the video. But I want to talk tonight about you continuing in, I don't know if you can call it part 2, but we started on the second set of papers that we received, second of 4 sets. And of course, we still talk about the book that this study is kind of based off of, 16 Methods to Effective Bible Study. It's not a newer book, but it's one I found a lot of good information in as we kind of went through this class. But tonight I want to talk about biographical, looking at some of the people. We've chopped up the word pretty good by books, by sections, verses. And now I want to look more toward individuals. Studying the people of the Bible. I want to start with naming some individuals, according to these living examples that it says here on our slide number 3. And I need to pen. I'm bad about this. Tell me when I need to skip this. But I want to talk about living examples. Who are some of the living examples of faith in action that we think of? Those who are faithful in the Bible. And Abraham. Noah. Moses. Caleb. Joshua. What about those who sinned and had consequences? David. Adam and Eve. Korah. Solomon. Also King Saul.
Ahab the Rahab. Ahab.
Samson. Jonah. Had to be taken by fish to where he was supposed to go. Judas.
Bad consequences.
When did God show faithfulness and protection, or to who did he give faithfulness and protection to?
Lots of them.
Lots of them.
Whoever followed his commands,
Okay.
they did.
Who did you say? Job? Absolutely.
Rahab.
Rahab? Noah? Noah spent 100 and some odd years building a boat when it wasn't raining.
Joseph.
Joseph? Israel in the wilderness? How many times did some of the apostles or early believers have to go before authorities, like the Caesar, or somebody who had the authority to take their life?
Oh.
And how many times do we see that they escaped, found not guilty or pardoned or whatever the case may be? Failures and successes. Moses sees but fails to enter the promised land because he did one thing wrong that we're aware of. Judas followed Jesus for 3 years on a journey like none other, and yet he still defects from his teaching. What about Peter? How many times do we see him acting inconsistently? He tries to walk on water, and he's successful for a little bit.
Cut off the ear.
Cut off the ear. Denied Jesus 3 times. Paul had to confront him in the book of Galatians, also recorded in the book of Acts. Very inconsistent, yet he's often viewed as the first among the apostles.
What I think was neat about Peter is when Jesus asked them, "Who do people say that I am?" And then he asked Peter, he said, "Well, who do you say that I am?" And then he told him, "You're Jesus the Christ, the Son of the living God." So he knew who Jesus was.
Mm-hmm. But what did that mean for Peter when he did that? I mean, when Jesus said, "Who do you say that I am?" do you think that he spoke right up? Because
Well, doesn't it
to say that of Jesus is to blaspheme if he's wrong.
but then did God direct him to say that? He said, man hadn't told you this, but I forget how that says.
I think he had some sort of, I don't want to say intuition, but
Revelation.
working of the Spirit.
Yeah.
And kind of like when we have our own personal Bible study, that we'll notice things, we'll pick up on things we want to study more. I don't want to say that we're possessed by the Holy Spirit, but at the same time, we're told that we're given the Holy Spirit. Peter hadn't had that yet, but the things of Christianity were at work on all of them. But for Peter to actually have to say the words out loud, not just maybe know them in his mind or think them in his mind, he declared it among the whole circle. I'm kind of thinking he sat there for a while, maybe around the campfire, drawing in the dirt with his foot, or kicking some coals in the fire, or something. I'm thinking he really had a hard time. He really sweated over, should I say this out loud and declare it? I mean, we know he finally did, but this is very applicable to what we're talking about with successes and failures. That's Peter's biggest success, is that he was the first to rightly declare Jesus as the Son of God when they were on their mission, when Jesus was on his 3-year ministry. I'm going to turn over to our next page. I've got some kind of little add-on here, so I can't see this screen too well, but the aim of what we're trying to do is we're trying to learn biographical facts. Details revealed in a single book or maybe across all of Scripture. So the New Testament reflects quite a bit of the Old Testament and comments on some of the Old Testament characters. And we can learn a lot from looking at an individual And I want to stop for a second to say that there are study tools available to us, so we don't have to wonder. They have specialized Bible dictionaries, specialized Bible encyclopedias, and I don't mean bookshelves and bookshelves and bookshelves, but if you want to read a paragraph about somebody, you want to get all the verses that mention somebody, there are easy ways to do that without overwhelming us. None of us have to be master's degree, doctorate type people in order to use some of these tools. And if you need any help with those, I'm definitely available. Brian's available. Eric's available. We have a librarian here. We might know a little bit of something about it. I don't know. I don't want to put him on the spot. He might know something about it. But things like keeping in mind the idea of this is one person. Kind of like we talked about different sections of a book of the Bible work together to make up an entire coherent thought or coherent argument. Different characters throughout the biblical narrative, salvation history, God's plan of salvation, God's plan of restoring man back to Him. It's carried out with people. And as we've seen throughout the scriptures, they're all imperfect people. Some way or another, somebody's messing up. They're not perfect saints. But things that we can look at, like birth and early life. We look at perhaps Adam and Eve. What's significant about their birth and early life?
They were born.
Exactly. They were created. They were formed out of the... They weren't born. They were the first created human beings. Their parentage was directly related to God who formed them. Place and circumstances in a world that did not know sin. Now, can we even imagine such a setting? I don't think we have any idea what it would be like to be in such a setting. We look at Moses, perhaps. What was significant about Moses' parentage?
That's raised by Pharaoh's daughter.
Because,
They were killing babies at that time.
okay, so he was raised by someone who was not afraid to defy the law. Or he was born to a parent who was not afraid to defy the law, the man's law. She was not going to kill her child. She placed him as she did where he was found by Pharaoh. Now, what is the place and circumstance of his early training, for example?
Sure, his
His mother, his
mother
own
taught him.
mother.
Which was,
The first 5 years or so while he was weaned is with his mom, the Jochebed.
and then where did he go off to train?
Palace.
Learned all that at the
Finest training perhaps in the world. You think that may have benefited him any, those 38, 40 years he was wandering around the wilderness? Absolutely. But through all these ideas that we have to keep together that no one individual, except maybe for Jesus, is kind of an overarching over all of this. There's one person that had one piece of the puzzle. We look at, for example, in this first slide, birth and early life, look at Isaac. Who was his parent?
Abraham.
And what did Abraham have to do?
Sacrifice.
He was an altar.
I mean, do you think that would be a defining point in your life? When you're told to look back over life and say, what was one of your significant moments? Well, Dad tied me up and threw me on the log fire. And he had his arm up like this, and it was going to come down, but something happened and it just wouldn't come down. I mean, Abraham had faith, and Isaac had faith that everything was going to work out. Places and circumstances, early training and experience. But yet Abraham did not ever see his prodigy being as many as the sands of the beach or the sands of the sea. He never saw that, but he was promised that. He was promised to become a mighty nation and be God's special possession. Now, when we think about things like conversion, maybe an experience or a call to a specific task, what comes to mind when you think of somebody who's called to do a specific task? And I'm sure there's
Fishermen.
several called to.
Paul.
Peter, James, John.
All of the apostles.
All the apostles in one way or another.
Yeah.
Paul, and it really took some work on Paul. I mean, Jesus had to strike him down blind and say, listen, man.
You know, my thinking on Paul is that he loved God.
Mhm.
I mean, he really did. He just had to make the transition from Judaism to following Christ.
Mhm. That's one thing that I've noticed in a lot of the study that or not really study, observation, is you see a lot of the modern day popular names in Christianity. It seems like the ones that are most enjoyable to hear are not the ones trying to put on a show. Not trying to be about, look at me and how much I know. I'd rather listen to George Ball than about anybody. I'd rather listen to, most of the guys that were here back in June or July than just about anybody. We talk about conversion experience and call to specific task. Noah saved the world because the water's coming. You think about how for 100 years he was working on this boat. What do you think the rest of his family had to endure, had to hear? Scoffs, being made fun of. What his wife had to go through, hearing, your husband's crazy man. He's building a ridiculously large boat that's never going to go anywhere.
We can face that today too, Donnie.
Okay.
With political and religious leaders that are in the world today,
Mm-hmm.
and how they bombard us with nonsense and lies,
Mm-hmm.
and the Antichrist or whatever you want to call it. But we know that when the time comes, it's not going to be too good for them unless they repent.
Mm-hmm.
But, those days of suffering for us are going to be over.
One message, and I'm not sure if you preached it or if Brian preached it, and it was on Noah. And I never had thought about 8 people in the ark? And all the millions or even hundreds of thousands, I don't know how many was there. But I did not think that Noah's parents could have still been alive. He had brothers and sisters, nieces and nephews,
Mm-hmm.
and all of them were lost. And knowing that was going to happen,
Mm-hmm.
the burden that a lot of these people had on them during the time of their service. I can't even begin to fathom what that would be. I don't know. It's hard to, when we have a loved one or a friend, close friend that dies without the Lord. But when you have a whole nation
Mm-hmm.
that's destroyed, it's hard to think about.
And if you think about it, though we're talking about the scriptures, because salvation history is not over, we can insert our own stories into this. We obviously can't call it biblical and hold it to the same standards as the Bible, but you know, we can relate to these individuals and their struggles and you being passed over for a promotion because you won't go out to the company outing at the casino or at the bar. I know people that's happened to.
I just always celebrated the Passover when that happened.
What's that?
I just celebrated the Passover whenever that
Passed
happened.
over.
I passed over. Sorry, Tony.
That's all right. We'll forgive you. It's part of my.
You know, and another thing about them people in Noah's time, a lot of them people would have had second or third hand knowledge of Adam and Eve and their creation. I mean, it's not like us that happened thousands of years ago. It happened within maybe the lifetime of their parents or their grandparents would have had personal contact with Adam and Eve or Seth or whoever.
Yeah.
You know, so they would have had that knowledge.
Absolutely.
They could have known them, some of them.
Yeah.
Well, the oldest man, 969 years,
This is-
Methuselah, he would have been, what?
That was Noah's grandfather.
Yeah. I know.
I know from the
I don't have the chart in front of me.
Well, no, I remember that thing of creation.
So there would have been a succession of memory here in this time period that we're talking about. First 11 chapters of Genesis. First, I think 6 or 8, maybe 9 goes through Noah's flood, and then afterwards we have the Tower of Babel. But exactly, the ministry for the Lord, the nature of it. You know, Noah's call was to save, you know, a remnant of creation so that it wouldn't be completely wiped out.
Change page, John.
Oh, sorry. We think about, you know, the ministry, you know, for the Lord, and the one that I think about is Moses spoke to God face to face as a friend. I mean, it is as any of us in here would speak to each other. You know, Noah was permitted to speak that openly and freely with God. And I don't know how he did it. You know, none of the rest of the people even wanted to hear God. Noah, you go up to the mountain and you hear the message God wants for us because we're afraid.
Moses, not Noah.
Moses. Yeah, Moses, you go up there and then we're going to wonder where you're at and we're going to make a golden calf in the meantime because we can't wait to get the word of the Lord.
A few days later.
Exactly. You know, in the meantime, you know, reaction of others to Moses coming back down the mountain. They had to run for cover because there were some stone tablets flying through the air. The reaction will be the reaction of Jonah climbing out of the fish after 3 days.
Oh, he went to Nineveh and he spoke.
Take a shower, man, then we'll hear what you have to say.
Good one, buddy.
Peter and John before the Sanhedrin. Paul before the Sanhedrin. Stephen goes into this lengthy history, which the Jews love to hear their own history of, you know, the Israel nation. You know, these things are important because it gives us an idea, a backdrop to who these individuals were, not just names on a page that we hear did things sometime years ago that has nothing to do with us. Now, character evaluation. This is probably highly personal. Was Noah good or bad?
Both.
Both. Abraham, was he good or bad?
Both.
He had his problems.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Isaac, good or bad?
Had his problems.
Yeah.
Adam?
He definitely had problems. He
Yeah,
had a woman issue.
Thank you, Barb.
Yeah, impact issue.
But we can talk about King Saul, who was after David. Saul has slayed his 1,000, but David his 10,000s. Nebuchadnezzar that was with Daniel, tried to take the youth and indoctrinate them throughout their whole childhood away from God. David, shepherd boy turned king. Did some good, did some bad. Jonah did some good, did some bad. Judas, we don't hear about any of his good, but I'm assuming he hung around for 3 years. He probably did something good at some point.
Took care of the money.
Help himself.
Joseph, either one. Old Testament Joseph or human father of Jesus. Human parent, male parent of Jesus. Either one, good or bad.
I don't know that they recorded anything bad about Joseph in the Old Testament. I mean, about everything that I can remember, he was pretty straight up.
His
Yeah.
brothers didn't think so.
Well, now that could have been a problem.
Well, he might have been
He could have
proud.
rubbed that in about that coat.
Yeah.
He could have dangled
My
that.
mama made this for me.
Yeah, in the visions.
That's a theory I've heard before. You know, he was probably such a whiny, sissy kind of a guy. His brothers had to do something about him. I've heard that before.
What about Job?
Oh,
Job, upright and blameless before God. Did he stay that way?
He kind of hesitated a few times.
He hesitated a few times.
Question God.
He had some questions for God.
Did I mention in here two things that the devil was not allowed to take away from Job? Two things.
His
I
life
think
and
in
his, and his wife.
Yes, exactly right. And I hate to say this, but that just goes to show me how important the importance God puts on a man's wife. And I said to somebody, you know, there's lots of things that I could lose, but I don't want to lose her. And I'm serious about that. You know, my kids are my grandkids, but I remember Roger Chambers, I think it was, we used to go to Hillsborough and take, what were they called? They were like couples retreats.
Yeah.
And he said, you know, when you're dealing with your children, you just have to remember to tell them they're just passing through. She was here before you got here, and she's going to be here after you
that will
leave.
take you out.
You know, so they're, you know, I mean, I'm probably all wrong on that, but it just seems like that's, even though, you know, she told Job
Curse God.
to curse God and die, you know, she didn't, you know, he didn't lose his wife.
All that proves is you don't always want to do what they say.
I was gonna say that might have been part of his punishment too. He couldn't take his wife away, she had to stay there.
Well, that's where I thought.
Man, I was trying to be kind.
I know you were.
I was kind of standing back because I thought that's where he was going. But character evaluation. Was this one that was good or was this one that was bad? After the kingdom divided, we had all these kings, and then eventually we had kings of the north and kings of the south. God told them it was a bad idea from the start, and the overwhelming majority, and I say that because I can't remember if they were all bad, but an overwhelming majority of them were bad.
Yeah.
I mean, like there may have been one that was kind of okay, maybe one that was all right at the very most. But that's what, out of 16, 18, 20 something kings maybe? The odds aren't good. But this is what Israel wanted. Samuel, Joshua, Rahab, some of these other names that we're talking about, good, bad, indifferent. You think about Joshua, he's the one I feel for. He had the right idea all along the first time. Let's go in there and take the land. No, we're not going to do that. Then God says, go wander around for a while. They try and take it anyway and they get clobbered. And then they have to go walk around the desert for 30 some odd years, 40 years. He has to go with them, even though he was saying the right thing all along.
Well, I've been telling them every day too.
Absolutely. But we also think about relationship with others. I remember this time. Relationship with others. Noah and the rest of the world, I'm sure he was on the outs with. Here's one. Adam and Eve.
Yeah.
They were the entire, they were the entirety of humanity. Couldn't blame the rest of society on what they did. Really couldn't blame anybody but themselves, but one pointed the finger to the other and says, the one that you put here with me, this is what happened. I was minding my own business, she came along, she brought this fruit that you said not to eat and said it was good, and then that's what happened. The disciples. Was it Peter, James, and John that were supposed to pray in the Garden of Gethsemane in the night of Jesus?
They went to
What did he come back and find them doing? Not once, but at least twice.
sleeping.
Sleeping. Peter decides that Christianity needs to be a warrior type religion. He cuts off an ear of a Roman soldier. We have the various groups that Jesus had to combat: scribes, Pharisees, Sadducees, where some of the most wonderful teaching in the world comes out of. Sermon on the Mount, Good Samaritan, which may or may not be a parable, may actually have been a real life thing that was known about at the time, a real life happening. Israel in its relationship with other kingdoms. Second time they come back around to take the land of Canaan. They take Jericho pretty easily. What happens in the second city?
They get booked.
They kept stuff they weren't supposed to keep, and the little city that was supposed to be a knockover, sent them back and sent them running. Death and comments about it. Who do we see passing away in the scriptures?
I think of Stephen when he passed away, and
Mm-hmm.
that Paul brought that back to mind, what he did, and even as holding the coats of the men that were going to be stoning him. I mean, that had laid heavy on his heart.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Paul had a lot of stuff he had to deal with. We don't exactly know what his thorn in the flesh is. Some think that he had vision problems. Some think that he was, weak in his overall health. Could have just been the weight of having to think about all the things that he did to Christians before coming to Christ. Like say the stoning of Stephen. Stephen stood his ground. He would not back down from the scriptures. Peter and John, in the same way before their trial, they did the same thing. Jesus, the same thing. And he was found not guilty, but the emperor, Caesar, I can't remember his exact name, gave in to the crowd. Said, whatever the crowd wants. And Jesus went to the cross.
How long was it after Moses struck the rock? And that's kind of why he didn't let Moses into the promised land, right? How long of a time span do you know between him doing that and, did God just wait for him to pass away and then let him go in? Or what's the timetable there?
I don't know the timetable between Moses doing that and then them going to the promised land, but I know that Moses was taken up on a mountain by himself, and he was able to be given a vision of the promised land.
See it.
And that Moses was buried or taken by God to an undisclosed place because what do people do?
Worship there.
People want to worship anything they can get a hold of. And I'm sure that with Moses being the prophet, that's what likely would have happened and would have been very displeasing to God. What are the reasons for some of the inclusions of some of the facts that we have? Do we need to know that Israel wandered 40 years? Do we need to know that it took Noah 100 years to build a boat? That it may have been somewhere between 12 to 1500 years from the time of Adam to the time of Noah? What are the reasons for some of the facts that we have in the Bible?
I think the timetable for Noah,
Mhm.
people would not probably ever believe that could ever happen.
Mhm.
If you said, oh, Noah built that in 10 years, people would be like, that, there's no way. But then
Mhm.
also people would probably also say, no, nobody would live to be, 100 and still be able to do that. I mean, just people today that don't know a lot about, biblical things.
You know, it also gives us some explanations, and it gives us a history. You know,
Mhm.
we can look at world history just by reading the Bible.
Mhm.
And it explains stuff like, how come there's such an enormous amount of fossils on Hanover Hill and
Mhm.
the railroad cut? You know, if there wasn't a flood, how did they get there?
Mhm.
You know, and the secularists can lie about that, but, you know, we have proof.
My new favorite one, I've only had it for about a year or two because it's when they came up with it, was they found shark teeth in Mammoth Cave. And I look at the evolution, like, what do you do with that?
Oh, but they said that sharks swam in the
Yeah.
rivers.
Yeah, it's like, what do you do with that? We're 1,000 miles inland, what do you do with that? If there wasn't a
Right.
Um,
Well, it just makes sense though that things happen and it's everyday life
mhm,
of people, and it makes sense that can happen.
mhm,
And it affects, what one person does affects someone else.
mhm.
And they all tie together, and it does weave a story for us to look back on.
Mhm.
I think it shows too, just like God making them wander in the wilderness for 40 years and like waiting until that generation passed away. It just goes to show like how stern kind of that God can be. And his punishment on them was like they weren't, that generation did not get to go in the promised land. And that, I don't know, I think that's good for us to know that God,
It means what he says.
yeah.
But also that he's willing to forgive. Because we don't see, aside from Jesus, we don't see anybody that gets it right all the time. Like I said, when they had to wander around in the wilderness for 40 years because, 2 guys had it right and the other 10 had it wrong, or the other however many had it wrong, God had a plan for that. They went out into the wilderness, and while they were out there, we get the book of Leviticus. He puts together the priesthood and all the festivals and things of that nature. Then in Numbers, we put all the physical pieces together. We put together what the tabernacle is going to look like, what the stuff inside is going to look like, how it's going to be made, what it's going to be made of. God even blesses the ones who are making that stuff with extra ability to make sure it's done how he wants it done.
Tommy, I have a question. Was God against Moses sending the spies into the land of Canaan? I don't remember reading that in the scripture, but for some reason that comes to mind.
I don't think he was, because I remember that the spies brought back, like fruits and
Right.
produce from the land. I remember reading about a cluster of grapes that weighed like 12 pounds. I mean, you go to Walmart and you see a little,
Costs a lot of money.
yeah, that little snack of grapes, and you think about, a cluster of grapes so big that they had a rod that they carried them like this, with one on each side or 2 on each side. That's some grapes. I don't think he had anything that I remember as being against it. I think he was against listening to their judgment not to go and take the promised land that he already told them to take.
Maybe that's what it was.
But we look at reasons for the inclusions of these facts. Nobody was perfect. Today, as the church moves forward towards the end of salvation history, we don't have to be perfect. We're not required to be perfect. We are required to be faithfully obedient. to the fullest measure of our understanding. And that statement could open up a whole can of worms. I really would take probably 3 or 4 more classes to get through, but we're to be faithfully obedient to the fullest of our understanding.
Or suffer the consequences.
Exactly. Exactly. I've heard the argument from some people, and I think this is just ridiculous. I don't go to church because they would basically learn what they're supposed to be doing that they don't want to do, because they want to go out and live party life or, whatever.
I think the one thing we was talking about earlier is our worldview. And I think you all try to hammer that home.
Mm-hmm.
That's why we believe a lot of why we believe, because of our worldview. And the world doesn't believe that. But they don't believe like we believe. Like we said, shark's teeth in Mammoth Cave, Our worldview is different.
Well, if we didn't have a proper understanding of faithfully obedient to the fullest of our understanding, we could just as easily say, with an improper, view of the Bible, God accepts everybody that's imperfect, so as long as we're just good enough, we can still go to heaven. That's asking how worldly can I be and still go to heaven? That's not at all what anybody worth their salt would teach at all.
No.
But we see a lot of that out there today, sadly.
Barb just pointed out, Numbers 13, 1 and 2. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Send men to spy out the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the people of Israel. For each tribe of their fathers you have sent a man, every one a chief among them." So God did organize it for sanctuary.
I think the Bible makes it very clear in its own wording why that stuff's in there.
Yeah.
It's in there for our instruction.
Exactly.
Facebook is not going to get us to heaven if we take our instructions from there. It's not a good thing to do anymore, but, that's
Some
plain
stuff.
facts. That's what this Bible is for our instructions. If we're going to be Christians, we need to take our instructions from there.
Absolutely. But when we look at some of the things that we can do with the text, obviously without doing damage to it, is we can look at the facts of any individual's life with the purpose of instructing others, whether it be a preacher or someone in a class, Sunday school class, Wednesday night class like this one. And we can talk about how these individuals as pieces work together to do what they do. Noah was told to be, once again, the idea was, multiply and fill the earth. What did they do? Multiply, and they stayed around and built the Tower of Babel. God dispersed everybody. Then the earth filled. Then we see Abraham come on the scene. Abraham is one piece. He's the guy who did what he was told when he was told, "Go out from your father, and I'll show you a place to go." He packed up and left. Didn't even know which way to begin walking.
His father wasn't even believing God, did he?
Maybe some pagan cultic type regional thing, but not the God of the Bible. Then we see Abraham has a son. God says, "What are you doing? I didn't tell you to do that." And then has to send off his concubine, and I'm drawing a blank.
Esau.
Hagar and
Ishmael.
Ishmael.
Oh,
Yeah.
Esau.
Yeah. And on a historical note, the Muslims actually believe he was the chosen seed of God, and that's where the whole Muslim thing comes in. We understand it to be Isaac. Through Isaac, it was Isaac carried on the promise. Promise was then carried on. There were 12 sons. 12 sons got rid of the one. The one ended up in Egypt, saved the nation, come on over to the land of Goshen, put you up. And what we see, each individual didn't do the whole didn't do the whole thing. They each had their piece of responsibility, and the whole way along, God had checks and balances to make sure they're still going to be faithful to me. I'm going to test them. I'm going to give them trials to make sure that they're going to do what I have in mind or in store for them to do. Biographical narrative of the entire person's life or span is considered a special emphasis on God's dealing with the individual in certain events that relate to the individual or the nation. The them is usually not so much on a personal development, although it may take place, but on God's care and protection of His own. See, like this is what I just got done saying, was that no one person did it all. Even Jesus, he still came from the line of David. That was David's piece. David was to ascend to the king, to be king, and he was told that the Messiah will come down through your line. And you think about, what do we say about David? Was he good or bad? We kind of went like this. Did some good, did some bad. Well, Goliath also had Uriah killed for personal gain, we'll call it that. One good way to outline the life of an individual is to look at significant or climactic events as dividing line. We can take Joseph for an example. His early life, he was rejected, had some time in prison in Egypt, then he was exalted to the number 2 or 3 place, we think, in all of Egypt, right below the Pharaoh, when he needed to save the nation. Another example we look at is Moses. He has a very neat and clean 40 here, 40 there, and 40 at the end. 40 years in Egypt. Raised by Pharaoh's daughter. In the trained with the finest learning in the entire known world at the time. Stood up for one of his countrymen and killed an Egyptian, had to flee. Spent 40 years herding goats and found a bush that was on fire but didn't burn up. And started talking to him. Then he led God's people, not because he wanted to. He tried to come up with every excuse not to. And he finally said, take your brother Aaron and go.
Can I say something that has nothing to do with this?
Absolutely.
But 40, 40, 40. Saul was king for 40 years, David was king for 40 years, and Solomon was king for 40 years.
Reigned for 40 years, or 40 days and 40 nights.
There you go.
And Moses' life was broke up into 40.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Isn't that second 40, or the second and third 40 all the same though? 40 years in the wilderness and 40 years of leading God's people?
No.
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 He
No.
was
When Moses killed the Egyptian, he fled and lived.
in
40
40
In
years.
the wilderness, okay,
Yeah.
okay, okay. I thought that was when they all left
he
Egypt,
was
was in the
120.
wilderness for 40
Yeah.
years. Okay.
So he got to spend 80 years in the desert.
Yep.
He liked the climate.
I can't imagine that. But we can look at other things. What was this individual? What were his character? What was his character overall? Before we start to know or read anything about him at specific points, what are his characters? We don't know that Judas is a bad guy until we get down to, Judas, you are going to betray me. Until then, we have 3 years of thinking Jesus has got a lockstep, 12-man roster.
Well, even Daniel, we didn't know too much about him until he was taken into captivity and, we see his character pretty fast. He's not going to eat the king's death, but he was trained up in the Jewish religion to eat good.
Mhm.
Yet, strict food guidelines. He must have been a good example because he had some guys following.
Exactly. What made these individuals the way they were? What struck Judas just so wrongly with Jesus' words that he ran out and actually confirmed what Jesus said? I mean, I would think that with every fiber of my being, I would try and not do what Jesus said was going to happen. But somehow he managed to fall into fulfilling what Jesus said.
He had a heart issue.
Mhm.
He had a heart issue.
What made Peter the way he was?
Who?
Peter. I think Peter was, like we say, a fisherman, probably owned his own fishing business. Peter seems to be very prominent. I think he was just a dollars and cents guy. Let me see it. Put it in front of me. Let me see it in concrete terms. Peter knows you can't walk on water. But yet he tries and he's actually successful. Then he starts thinking about what he's doing, and that's when he falls. Well, what was the result of what some of these individuals became? What became of Noah? He survived, and his family survived. His sons and their wives survived. But we don't know some of the other backdrop, like you're saying. How many people did Noah know? How many related family did not make it to the ark? We know all of them, but how many was that?
Do you not feel like there was any good in Judas at all? I mean, he pretty much committed suicide after he did what he did. If he didn't care at all, I don't think he would have done that. Do you? Like, if he didn't care, he would have been like, oh well, he's gone, and just move on to the next thing. But I think, he was so devastated by it.
I think he finally
Yeah.
realized the gravity of what he did after the fact.
Remorse.
Yeah.
Where's he going to go and live? He's killed the biggest. At the time, most were not convinced that Jesus was the Messiah. A significant amount were, but Jesus has killed the most popular religious figure, at the very least, the most popular teacher in the known world. Where's he going to go and live and not be under some sort of threat or danger?
Do you think that Jesus chose him because he knew what he was going to do and he needed that to happen to fulfill everything? Or do you think Jesus saw any good in him at all, like to choose him to come along? Or, do you think he just did it
I really don't know.
because he was a means to an end?
I don't think he chose him because that would be,
He'd be going guest as well.
yeah.
And as-
I think he,
Did he just start following Jesus? What do you mean? As far as choosing him, didn't he?
I mean, I don't think he
didn't Jesus
chose
ask
him
them
to-
like to kind of? Didn't he kind of pick
Choosing.
who he wanted?
Yeah.
I mean, so
oh yeah, that, but he already
Follow
knew what
me.
he knew what was going to happen.
Jesus.
Yeah.
Yes, and I mean that's what
Yeah.
I'm saying. Do you guys think that's why he
Yeah.
kind of handpicked him because he needed that to happen?
I don't know exactly to what extent Jesus did and did not know when he was on earth. I mean, yes,
Yeah.
he's God, but he's also man.
Uh-huh.
And it's really hard to start dividing up what did he know or what didn't he know.
What he was,
He just
what he
heard
limited
the
him.
Father choose him.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, it could have been such a thing as Peter, James, and John were mending the net, and Jesus said, "Follow me." And Jesus said, "Hey, can I come too?" "Yeah, sure, come on."
Right.
I can't say for sure that didn't happen. But we think about some of the accomplishments that some of these individuals had, traits or accomplishments. Where am I at on here?
Right there.
Oh, man, let's get some
One
stuff.
more day.
What was the environment that some of these individuals were in? You got to consider Jesus, for as popular as he was, his ministry was only 40 to 60 mile radius. He did not travel the entire world like Paul. Traits and accomplishments are other things that we can look at. Peter was all over the place, but when it came time to take the reins, Acts chapter 2, he laid it down. Now, he wavers at Cornelius' house. He still doesn't have it completely right, but when it counts, he's gotten it right, or he's amended his errors as best he can. What incidents might have occurred to demonstrate or illustrate certain traits? We saw Judas's flaw. We've seen Peter's back and forth. We saw David, even though he was king, was back and forth. Noah, even after the flood and after everything, we don't exactly know the exact happening, but he cursed Ham because he saw him or looked on him naked. And we don't exactly know what that means, but whatever it means, when Noah regained his composure, he knew something had happened and gave a curse to Ham. The accomplishments of some of these individuals, we can pick out some accomplishments to talk about, demonstrate significant accomplishments, significant pitfalls. What made these accomplishments possible? We think about, no man is an island. Somebody's always standing on the shoulders of their predecessors. I think about Polycarp, who was, the Apostle John's close associate. When he was burned at the stake, he was given, where church history says that he was given a chance to recant, and he said, the Lord has never failed me in all my years. Why would I start now? I know that's not in the scriptures, but we have church history where we are pretty sure most of the apostles, except for John, died horrible deaths. The church was harshly persecuted. We know that, but the church is still here today. The influence, we cannot deny, of these individuals that helped carry out God's work of salvation, His plan of salvation, His plan of salvation history. What influence did any particular man have on others in events in their time? This approach is to suggest, how the hearers can improve their influence on their society. We try hard. We don't turn anybody away that wants to come and learn about Christ. What influence did they have in their time? Peter, when the time came, stood up and boldly preached. And a large portion of his Acts chapter 2 sermon comes from the book of Joel, whom we don't know hardly anything about outside of the book of Joel. But it must have been important enough that Peter had it committed to memory somewhat. And I want to close out by looking at some character questions that we can use in our own study to try and get ourselves behind the name on the page. We should collect any information that we can, making sure that we're not collecting, like for instance, Herod. There's all kinds of Herods. We want to make sure that we're not mixing them up, or Joseph. We want to make sure we're not mixing them up. Collect all the information we can about the same individual. Study the ancestry. Like we said, Abraham on down through to an established nation. Value of early training, if any. We talked about Moses. What work was accomplished by this particular person? We talked about several. What crisis was faced? We can talk about what traits did he display, good or bad. What friendships did he have, good or bad. Was he betrayed at all? Or did somebody stick up for an individual at all? What influence did this person have on others? What growth does this person exhibit over the course of their life? What religious experiences did this person have? Did they have a prayer life? Did they talk to God? Did they seek God? Did they have faith? Were they a person of service, worship, and encouraging others? Did they manage the things of God well? What faults or shortcomings are revealed? Was there some great sin that was exposed? What led to it? What was the result and how was it dealt with? What was the influence of this person's character on the next generation? Was this person considered a type or antitype of Christ or anything from later on in the New Testament? Was this one of the greatest lessons from this person's life for you personally? See, when we use these things, we can kind of have a brotherhood with them, knowing that we're part of God's redemptive plan as well, because it's not completed yet. We see God used imperfect people. We see God used people that had serious flaws. But we also see consistently that God is willing to forgive and that people can change. Jesus and Paul both utilize this biographical approach. The kings of Israel can be studied in this way as well. Like we said earlier, several of them just didn't measure up. Have any comments, questions, concerns, or thoughts about studying individuals?
Well, I think it's
From the Bible.
encouraging because we know we have faults, but like David was a man after God's own heart. Yet, God knew what, his history, but that's encouraging to us that we can do wrong and He can still love us and forgive us. And it's kind of humbling, but it's encouraging to know that, your life isn't over till it's over. Rahab, who was, a questionable character to begin with, and not even part of the Jewish community, and she helped them to believe their God. And God used her. Yeah, and Ruth, the Moabite. That's encouraging.
Absolutely. Well, we'll go ahead and close with prayer. Lord, thank you for allowing us to come here to study and talk about a biographical way of looking at your word, where we can just look at the individuals and we can know that we kind of have a fraternal brotherhood, sisterhood with these individuals, because your plan of salvation is still working towards its completion, and that we can take comfort knowing that regardless of how bad somebody may have messed up, there's always a chance to turn to you for forgiveness and also usefulness for the kingdom. We ask that you be with those that we mentioned tonight in our prayer time. We ask that you be with us as we go on our way. We ask this in your Son's holy name.